Were medieval women just property? Did they never know love? Were they stuck at home with no say in anything from the years 500 to 1500? Number 7, trapped forever. Is women in the myth of unbreakable marriages. Many people believe that once a woman was married in the Middle Ages, she was bound for life, no matter what. The idea is that medieval marriage was an ironclad, permanent trap, especially for women, with no way out, no escape from a bad or even dangerous situation. This common thought paints a picture of women entirely stuck, without agency, forced to endure any hardship within their marriage until death finally offered release. The popular narrative often suggests that legal options for ending a marriage simply did not exist, leaving women powerless against difficult husbands or unfortunate circumstances. The truth, however, presents a more intricate and, at times, surprisingly flexible landscape for medieval women navigating their marital bonds. Records from various parts of medieval Europe reveal that while formal divorce, as we understand it today, allowing both parties to remarry freely, was indeed extremely rare and largely non-existent under church law, there were several avenues through which marriages could be nullified, separated, or dissolved. These processes were often complex, expensive, and protracted, but they were certainly available, and women often initiated them. The concept of annulment was a powerful tool. An annulment declared that a marriage had never been valid in the first place, meaning the union was considered void from the beginning. This was different from a divorce because it essentially erased the marriage, allowing both parties to remarry within the church's rules. Grounds for annulment included close kinship. If the couple were related within forbidden degrees of consanguinity, often up to the 4th degree, meaning they shared a great-great-grandparent. This was a frequent issue, especially among noble families who intermarried to consolidate power and land. A detailed genealogical chart from the English Royal Archives, dating to the late 14th century, documents numerous requests for papal dispensations for marriages where the spouses were found to be related, or petitions for annulment when such a relationship was discovered after the marriage had taken place. Such discoveries could invalidate years of matrimony. Another significant ground for annulment was a pre-contract. If one party had previously promised to marry someone else, and this promise was legally binding, the subsequent marriage could be annulled. This was especially relevant in an era where verbal promises witnessed by others held considerable legal weight. A collection of court testimonies from a 12th century French episcopal court details the case of a woman named Agnes who successfully argued for the annulment of her marriage to a knight because he had previously pledged himself to another woman. The court, after hearing witnesses, ruled in her favor, declaring her current marriage void. This highlights that a woman's testimony and the support of her community could indeed influence legal outcomes. Non-consummation of the marriage was also a valid reason for annulment. If a marriage was never physically consummated, it was not considered a full and binding union in the eyes of the church. This could arise from physical incapacity on the part of one's spouse, or simply a refusal to engage in sexual relations. A fascinating case from a 13th century Italian ecclesiastical court describes a noblewoman's petition for annulment based on her husband's inability or unwillingness to consummate their marriage over several years. The court appointed matrons to verify her claim, and after due process, the annulment was granted, freeing her to marry another man. This shows the church's involvement in very personal aspects of marital life and its capacity to provide remedies. Beyond annulments, which technically erased a marriage, there was also the option of legal separation known as divorce a mensa et thoro, or from bed and board. This type of separation did not allow either party to remarry, as the marriage itself was still considered valid in the eyes of God and the church. However, it did allow spouses to live apart, often with specific arrangements for property, financial support, and the care of children. Women frequently sought these separations on grounds of spousal abuse, desertion, or adultery. The records of the Archbishop of York's court from the 15th century contain numerous petitions from women seeking separation from abusive husbands. One such document details the sworn testimony of a woman named Eleanor, who described repeated physical assaults by her husband, prompting the court to grant her a separation and a modest allowance from his lands for her upkeep. This demonstrates a form of legal protection available to women facing domestic violence, even if it did not end the marriage entirely. Desertion was another common reason for separation. If a husband simply abandoned his wife and family, a woman could petition the church courts for a formal separation, which would legally recognize her independent status and sometimes grant her control over her own property or resources for survival. A series of letters from a wealthy merchant family in Bruges in the 14th century includes correspondence from a wife whose husband had left on a long trading voyage and simply never returned. After several years, she successfully petitioned for a separation, which allowed her to manage the family business and properties without his involvement, protecting her economic standing. While these processes were available, they were not easy or cheap. They often required extensive documentation, the testimony of witnesses, and sometimes powerful political or familial backing. For noblewomen, seeking an annulment often involved appealing directly to the Pope or a high-ranking ecclesiastical authority, a process that could take years and incur substantial costs. For women of lower social status, the local church courts were more accessible but still demanding. Despite the hurdles, the fact that women engage with these legal systems, bringing forward their cases and sometimes winning, challenges the notion of them being utterly powerless within their marriages. They actively pursued relief from unions that were untenable or damaging. The legal landscape of medieval marriage, while certainly different from modern divorce laws, was far from a monolithic, inescapable bind for all women. Number 6. The Unlearned Lady. Unveiling the myth of illiterate medieval women. A widespread belief about the Middle Ages suggests that women were almost universally uneducated and illiterate, confined to domestic chores with no access to books or learning. This view often presents medieval women as intellectually suppressed, unable to read or write, and therefore excluded from any form of intellectual or public life. The image is one of passive, unschooled individuals entirely dependent on men for information and communication beyond the immediate household. However, historical evidence paints a more nuanced and vibrant picture of female literacy and education, showing that many women, across different social classes, and for various reasons, did indeed read, write, and engage with scholarly pursuits. While formal schooling was not as widespread as it is today, especially for girls, education took many forms in the Middle Ages. For aristocratic women, literacy was often a practical necessity. Managing large estates, overseeing household accounts, corresponding with other noble families, and even engaging in political diplomacy required the ability to read and write. In letters exchanged between noblewomen, preserved in various European archives, attest to their active participation in written communication. A collection of letters from Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful 12th century queen, clearly shows her literacy, as she composed detailed political instructions, diplomatic correspondence, and personal messages. Her hand was trained not just for signing documents, but for crafting complex arguments and narratives. These letters were not merely dictated, they often bear the marks of direct composition. Noble households frequently employed tutors who educated both sons and daughters. Her daughters were taught subjects useful for managing a household, and their social standing, which often included reading, writing, Latin, and sometimes French or other vernacular languages. The illuminated manuscripts, commissioned by women, such as richly illustrated books of hours, provide tangible evidence of their literacy and their desire for personal devotional texts. The ownership and frequent use of these books suggests that women could read and understand the complex religious and moral texts contained within them. A 15th century Book of Hours, currently housed in a museum, bears annotations in a feminine hand, indicating direct engagement with its contents and personal study. For women in religious orders, particularly nuns, literacy was not just encouraged, but essential. And nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, study, and copying manuscripts. Monasteries and convents often served as centers of learning where women received a comprehensive education in Latin, theology, scripture, and sometimes even Greek. Many prominent female scholars, writers, and artists emerged from these religious communities. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, is a prime example. She wrote extensively on theology, medicine, botany, and even composed music. Her voluminous correspondence with popes, emperors, and other influential figures demonstrates a high level of literacy and intellectual engagement. The scriptorium of her abbey produced numerous manuscripts, many of which would have been copied and read by her fellow nuns. Beyond the nobility and the clergy, women in urban merchant families also often acquired literacy for practical reasons. Running a family business, keeping ledgers, writing invoices, and handling correspondence with distant traders often involved the wife. A collection of business letters from a 14th century Florentine merchant family reveals the significant role played by the wife, Margherita Dettini, in managing the family's financial affairs and correspondence while her husband was away. Her letters are not only functional but also demonstrate a sophisticated command of language and an understanding of complex business transactions. This suggests that literacy was a valuable skill for women in commercial settings, enabling them to contribute directly to the family's economic prosperity. Even among women of lower social standing, some degree of literacy was not unheard of. While widespread formal schooling was rare, literacy could be acquired through various means. Parish priests sometimes taught basic reading and writing. Guilds, particularly those related to scribes or booksellers, might have taught their daughters or wives the necessary skills for the trade. Some women learned to read devotional texts at home, taught by parents or other family members. The spread of vernacular literature, like romances, ballads, and saints' lives, also created a demand for readers beyond the educated elite. Fragments of personal letters and wills from common people, though less numerous than noble documents, occasionally showed that women possessed rudimentary reading and writing skills, enough to sign their names or understand basic written instructions. While it is true that overall literacy rates were lower in the Middle Ages than today, and certainly lower for women than for men in some periods and regions, it is a significant oversimplification to state that medieval women were generally unlearned. The evidence points to a diverse landscape of education and literacy driven by social status, practical necessity, religious devotion, and individual ambition. Many women actively participated in the intellectual life of their time, leaving behind a rich legacy of written works, personal correspondence, and scholarly achievements that challenge the persistent fiction of the illiterate medieval lady. Number 5. The domestic sphere only. Reconsidering women's work beyond the home. The common belief about medieval women often portrays them as entirely confined to the domestic sphere, their lives limited to household chores, child rearing, and textile work within the four walls of their homes. This view suggests that women had no role in public life, no involvement in the economy outside the family unit, and no activities that took them beyond their immediate domestic duties. This pervasive fiction paints a narrow picture of medieval womanhood, largely ignoring the extensive and varied contributions women made to society, agriculture, commerce, and crafts. The reality shows that medieval women were often vital participants in a wide array of activities that extended far beyond the confines of their homes. In rural communities, which constituted the vast majority of medieval society, women's labor was indispensable to the agricultural economy. They worked alongside men in the fields, performing crucial tasks such as planting, weeding, harvesting, and tending to livestock. Records from manorial estates across England dating from the 13th and 14th centuries list women performing specific agricultural duties and sometimes even earning wages for their labor, albeit often less than men. For example, accounts from the manor of Harleston in Norfolk detail payments made to women for harrowing fields and raking hay during harvest seasons. These records clearly demonstrate their active participation in the physical outdoor labor necessary for food production, dispelling the notion of their confinement to indoor domestic tasks. Beyond the fields, women were often responsible for managing household industries that produced goods for sale or exchange. This included baking bread, brewing ale, spinning and weaving cloth, and processing various foodstuffs. Many women became skilled artisans and entrepreneurs in these areas. In urban centers, women were heavily involved in various crafts and trades. They were members of guilds, sometimes even leading them, and worked as skilled craftswomen in professions such as weaving, embroidering, hat making, and selling goods in markets. The city records of Paris in the 13th century, particularly the Livre des Métiers Book of Trades, compiled by Etienne Boileau, show numerous women listed as masters of their own trades, including silkworkers, embroiderers, and even barbers. These women owned their shops, trained apprentices, and contributed significantly to the urban economy. Brewing ale was a particularly prominent occupation for women. Before the rise of large-scale commercial breweries, most ale was brewed in homes, and women were the primary brewers. They often sold their excess ale from their homes, turning it into a significant source of income for their families. Illuminated manuscripts often depict alewives identifiable by their characteristic tall hats, serving customers, a clear visual representation of their public economic role. In-court records from medieval English towns occasionally document women being fined for selling ale of poor quality or at unfair prices, further evidence of their active participation in this public trade. Women also played critical roles in commerce and trade. Wives of merchants often managed the family business, while their husbands were away on long journeys, overseeing accounts, managing inventory, and dealing with customers. As mentioned earlier, Margherita Dettini, wife of the Italian merchant Francesco di Marco Dettini, famously managed his extensive business empire from their home in Prato, handling complex financial transactions and correspondence. Her letters highlight her immense competence and responsibility in running a vast international trading operation, far from merely keeping a tidy home. Furthermore, women worked as shopkeepers, innkeepers, and street vendors, directly engaging with the public and participating in the bustling commercial life of medieval towns. They often ran taverns, laundries, and bathhouses, providing essential services to the community. prostitutes, while often marginalized, were also part of the urban economy and operated publicly, sometimes even under city regulation. Even in professions traditionally seen as male-dominated, women found niches. There are records of women working as scribes, particularly in convents, copying and illustrating manuscripts. Some women served as apothecaries, healers, and midwives, providing medical care and herbal remedies within their communities. The Trotula texts, a collection of medieval medical writings focusing on women's health, are attributed to a female physician in Salerno, suggesting the existence of female practitioners in respected medical roles. While the domestic sphere was undeniably central to the lives of most medieval women, their activities and contributions were by no means limited to it. They were integral to the agricultural economy, ran diverse businesses, practiced various crafts, and engaged in public commerce. The idea of women solely as homemakers is a significant oversimplification that fails to capture the breadth and depth of their economic and social roles in the Middle Ages. They were active, visible, and indispensable participants in the economic and social fabric of their time. Number 4, brutal bosses. Dissecting the myth of uniformly abusive medieval husbands, a pervasive fiction about medieval marriage suggests that husbands were universally harsh, domineering, and often physically abusive toward their wives, wielding absolute authority without challenge. This common thought paints a grim picture where medieval wives lived in constant fear, subject to their husbands' unchecked whims and violence, with no legal recourse or social support. The narrative implies that male supremacy was so absolute that any husband could treat his wife however he wished, without consequence. However, examining historical sources reveals a much more varied landscape of marital relationships, with laws, social customs, and individual temperaments shaping a complex reality that challenges this simplistic and often cruel portrayal. While it is true that medieval society was patriarchal and husbands were generally considered the head of the household, this did not automatically translate into universal abuse or unchallenged tyranny. The laws and social norms, while different from today, did offer some protections for women against severe cruelty, and expectations of marital conduct were not entirely one-sided. Church teachings, for instance, emphasized mutual respect and love within marriage, even as they upheld the husband's authority. Many sermons and theological treatises of the period stressed a husband's duty to care for, protect, and cherish his wife, not merely dominate her. A 13th century instructional manual for laypeople, widely circulated in England, advised husbands to treat their wives with gentleness and patience, warning against anger and violence. Legal avenues for redress, though limited compared to modern times, did exist for women suffering from extreme abuse. As discussed earlier, women could petition ecclesiastical courts for divorce, mensa, et thoro, separation from bed and board on grounds of cruelty. Numerous court records from various European regions attest to women presenting evidence of physical abuse by their husbands to seek such separations. For example, proceedings from the Consistory Court of London in the 15th century document several instances where wives successfully obtained separations based on documented patterns of violence or threats of violence from their husbands. These cases often involve witness testimony from neighbors or servants who had observed the abuse, indicating that society was not entirely blind or indifferent to such behavior. While a separation did not allow for remarriage, it did offer a legal escape from an intolerable and dangerous domestic situation, providing the woman with some degree of safety and financial support, often drawn from her husband's assets. Furthermore, medieval communities often had their own ways of expressing disapproval of egregious marital behavior. Public shaming rituals, such as the charivari or rough music, were sometimes directed at husbands who were perceived to be cruel or abusive, or wives who were seen as dominant or adulterous. While these could be crude and humiliating, they served as a form of social pressure, a way for the community to enforce moral codes and express collective disapproval of conduct that deviated from accepted norms of marital relations. These events suggest that community standards for acceptable marital conduct existed, and that extreme cruelty was not always tolerated silently. It is also important to consider the diverse range of individual personalities and relationships within medieval marriages. Not all marriages were loveless or abusive. Many letters, personal accounts, and epitaphs from the period suggest genuine affection, partnership, and even deep love between spouses. A collection of personal letters exchanged between a 15th century English couple, Marjorie and John Paston, reveals a dynamic and affectionate relationship, with Marjorie often managing family estates and business affairs while John was away. Their letters discuss everything from daily life and family matters to political intrigue, demonstrating mutual trust, respect, and emotional connection, far from a purely dominant, submissive dynamic. Jean often expresses concern for Marjorie's well-being and relies heavily on her judgment and competence. Similarly, the wills of medieval husbands often show them making provisions for their wives, granting them significant control over property or finances after their death, sometimes even against traditional inheritance customs. A will from a Parisian merchant in the late 14th century explicitly grants his wife control over his entire business and property until their children come of age, entrusting her with significant economic power and trust. Such provisions indicate not just a legal duty, but often a deep personal reliance and respect. While medieval society was indeed structured with men holding primary authority, reducing all medieval husbands to uniformly abusive figures is a historical oversimplification. Laws, church teachings, social pressures, and the evidence of countless personal relationships show that the reality was far more complex. Marriages varied widely, encompassing everything from genuinely affectionate partnerships to relationships fraught with conflict. The occasional legal intervention and social condemnation of abuse show that even within a patriarchal framework, there were checks and balances, and women were not always without recourse or empathy from their communities. Number 3, no money, no power. Challenging the fiction of women's economic helplessness, one of the most persistent fictions about medieval women is that they possessed no economic agency whatsoever, unable to own property, control money, or engage in any significant financial transactions independently. This view suggests that women were entirely dependent on their fathers or husbands for all financial matters, effectively making them economic non-entities. This narrative paints a picture of women as passive recipients of male generosity or control, with no independent means or influence in the economic sphere. However, historical evidence consistently reveals that medieval women, across various social strata, held considerable economic power, owned property, participated actively in trade, and often managed substantial financial affairs. At the highest levels of society, noblewomen often controlled vast estates and significant wealth. As heiresses, they brought lands and titles into their marriages, which often remained under their nominal or even direct control. Upon widowhood, noblewomen frequently became powerful landowners and administrators in their own right, managing complex manorial economies, overseeing tenants, collecting rents, and administering justice. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as a powerful duchess and later queen, controlled immense territories and wealth, making her one of the most powerful figures in Europe. Even before widowhood, many noblewomen held dower rights, which legally entitled them to a portion of their husband's estate, typically 1/3, for their maintenance should they be widowed. This was not a gift, but a legal right, providing economic security. In urban areas, women were active participants in the commercial economy. As discussed before, many women ran their own businesses, whether as brewers, bakers, shopkeepers, or skilled craftswomen. Guild records from various towns across Europe show women listed as masters of their trades, meaning they owned their workshops, employed apprentices, and managed their own finances. A particularly clear example comes from the ordinances of the Paris Silk Spinners Guild in the 13th century, which explicitly state that women could be masters, could own their own workshops, and could take on apprentices, just like men. These women generated their own income, paid taxes, and contributed directly to the urban economy. The wives of merchants also played a crucial role in economic life. When husbands were away on long voyages, wives often managed the family business, overseeing accounts, correspondence, and transactions. Margherita de Tini, mentioned earlier, not only managed her husband's affairs, but also engaged in her own independent investments and financial dealings, demonstrating her own economic acumen. There are records of other merchant wives independently conducting trade, lending money, and entering into contracts. The legal documents from various cities show women participating in courts to collect debts or enforce contracts, indicating their legal standing in financial matters. For women of more modest means, economic activity was equally vital. Women often worked as wage laborers in various sectors, from agricultural work to domestic service. They earned their own money, which contributed to their household's income or gave them some degree of personal spending power. Spinners, weavers, and seamstresses, often working from home, contributed significantly to the textile industry. Records from hospitals and charitable institutions also show women working in various capacities, often earning a small but steady income. Crucially, medieval women could own property, both movable goods and sometimes even land. While a woman's property often fell under her husband's control during marriage in many legal systems coverture, she typically retained ownership of her dowry and could often own and inherit property in her own right as a single woman spinster or as a widow. Wills from the period frequently show women bequeathing property, money, and valuable goods to their heirs, indicating their personal ownership and control over assets. For instance, a 15th century will from a woman in London meticulously details her bequests of silver plate, clothing, linens, and cash to various family members and charities, demonstrating her significant personal wealth and autonomy in its distribution. Furthermore, women were involved in lending and borrowing money. Records from moneylenders and pawnbrokers occasionally show women as both clients and even lenders, indicating their participation in the financial systems of the time. Some women managed their own investments, particularly widows who had inherited wealth or businesses. The idea that medieval women were economically helpless is a gross misrepresentation. While legal and social structures certainly presented challenges and differences from modern systems, women were active, vital, and often independent economic agents. They owned property, managed businesses, earned wages, and contributed significantly to the economies of their households, communities, and wider society. Their economic roles were diverse and substantial, far from the passive, dependent image often portrayed. Number 2. Loveless unions. Exploring affection and partnership in medieval marriages. A widespread fiction about medieval marriage is that it was universally a cold, loveless contract solely arranged for political or economic gain, with no room for personal affection, partnership, or emotional connection between spouses. This view implies that individuals, especially women, had no say in their choice of partner and were simply traded as pawns in alliances, forced into unions devoid of warmth or genuine feeling. The narrative suggests that medieval people did not marry for love, and that marital relationships were therefore purely functional and transactional. However, a deeper look into historical sources reveals that while practical considerations were certainly paramount, love, companionship, and genuine emotional bonds were often present and valued within medieval marriages, shaping complex and varied relationships. It is true that arranged marriages were common, especially among the nobility, where alliances, land, and power were major factors. Families often negotiated unions for their children from a young age, with little direct input from the prospective bride and groom. However, even within these arranged unions, affection could and often did develop over time. Historical letters and personal accounts from the period frequently show evidence of emotional bonds. The aforementioned correspondence of Marjorie and John Paston offers a clear example. Their letters, written over decades, reveal mutual care, concern for each other's well-being, discussions about their children, and reliance on each other's judgment. John often ended his letters with affectionate closings like, "Your true lover and husband," and Marjorie frequently expressed her longing for his return. Their pragmatic discussions about family affairs are intertwined with expressions of genuine attachment. For common people, while families still played a role in marriage decisions, there was often more flexibility and opportunity for personal choice, especially as property considerations were less grand. Marriages were frequently made within the local community, among people who knew each other. A strong sense of community and family support was critical for survival, and partnership within marriage was highly valued. Shared labor, mutual support, and companionship were fundamental aspects of a successful union. Village court records sometimes document disputes between families over broken marriage promises, indicating that individuals had expectations and personal investments in their chosen partners. Church teachings, while emphasizing the sacramental nature of marriage and its primary purpose for procreation, also acknowledged and encouraged mutual affection and respect between spouses. Preachers often urged husbands to treat their wives with kindness and wives to show devotion to their husbands. Marriage manuals, even those emphasizing wifely obedience, also stressed the importance of companionship and harmony in the household. A 15th century advice book for husbands, written in France, encouraged men to be gentle and understanding with their wives, stressing that a happy and cooperative marriage was beneficial for the entire household. This suggests that the ideal marriage, even if not always achieved, included elements of affection. Furthermore, many medieval love poems and songs, while often focused on idealized courtly love outside of marriage, also sometimes touched on the joys of marital love and companionship. Epitaphs on gravestones sometimes spoke of the deep love and sorrow felt by a surviving spouse, moving beyond mere familial duty to express profound personal loss. The tomb effigy of Eleanor of Castile and Edward I in Westminster Abbey, depicting them holding hands, symbolizes a known affectionate relationship that endured beyond political arrangements. These artistic and literary expressions, while perhaps idealized, suggest that the concept of love within marriage was not entirely alien to medieval society. Widows and widowers often remarried, sometimes multiple times, indicating that companionship and a desire for partnership were important. While practical considerations like managing a household or caring for children certainly played a role, the repeated willingness to enter into new unions suggests a search for companionship and emotional connection beyond mere necessity. And records from a Florentine orphanage in the 14th century show numerous petitions from widows seeking to remarry, often citing loneliness or the need for a partner to share life's burdens, alongside practical considerations. While the modern concept of romantic love as the sole basis for marriage may be a later development, it is a gross oversimplification to assume that medieval marriages were entirely devoid of affection, partnership, and emotional bonds. Practicality and social standing were undeniable factors, particularly for the elite, but within these frameworks, love, mutual respect, companionship, and genuine attachment often blossomed. The rich tapestry of medieval personal documents, literary works, and religious teachings reveals a complex reality where love and partnership, in various forms, were indeed integral to many marital relationships. Number 1, powerless pawns. Debunking the myth of women's total lack of influence. The most pervasive fiction about medieval women is that they were completely powerless, passive, and lacked any form of influence or agency in a male-dominated society. This widespread belief paints women as perpetual victims, entirely subjected to the will of men, with no voice, no rights, and no capacity to shape their own lives or the world around them. This narrative suggests that medieval women were universally oppressed, lacking any means to exert control over their circumstances or contribute meaningfully beyond a rigidly defined subordinate role. However, historical evidence from various periods and regions consistently demonstrates that medieval women, far from being powerless pawns, wielded significant influence in diverse spheres, often navigating and shaping patriarchal structures to their advantage. At the highest levels of society, royal and noble women frequently exercised immense political power. Queens, regents, and powerful noblewomen acted as advisors to kings, negotiated treaties, commanded armies, administered vast estates, and even ruled in their own right. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, ruled both France and England as queen, participated in crusades, and actively engaged in politics and diplomacy. Her influence was so profound that she often dictated policy and managed complex political alliances. Other notable examples include Blanche of Castile, who ruled France as regent for her son Louis IX and proved to be an exceptionally shrewd and effective ruler, suppressing rebellions and consolidating royal authority. These women were not merely figureheads, they were active political agents who left indelible marks on their respective nations. Beyond formal political power, noblewomen also wielded influence through their familial networks and patronage. They mediated disputes, arranged marriages, and cultivated alliances that significantly impacted political landscapes. Their households were centers of culture and politics, where decisions were made and influence was subtly, or not so subtly, exerted. Letters from noblewomen often reveal their active involvement in family strategies, offering advice to their husbands and sons, and managing complex social obligations. In the spiritual realm, women exercised significant influence as abbesses, mystics, and religious leaders. Abbesses governed large monastic communities, managed extensive properties, and held spiritual authority over both nuns and sometimes even lay populations. Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess, was not only a prolific writer and composer, but also a respected spiritual advisor to emperors, kings, and popes. Her visions and prophecies were widely respected, and her counsel was sought by some of the most powerful men in Europe. Other female mystics, like Catherine of Siena, wielded immense moral and spiritual authority, intervening in papal politics and advising rulers. Their influence was not based on physical power, but on their perceived connection to the divine, which commanded respect across society. In the economic sphere, as previously discussed, women's influence was undeniable. Women ran businesses, managed family finances, and contributed vital labor to agricultural and urban economies. Their economic contributions gave them leverage and a voice in household decisions, and often within the broader community. The wife of a prosperous merchant, for example, often held significant sway in household spending, business investments, and the social standing of the family. The financial independence gained from owning property or managing a trade gave many women a degree of autonomy and influence that challenges the notion of total powerlessness. Even at the local level, common women found ways to exert influence. They were active in their local communities, participating in social networks, informal justice systems, and community decision-making. Women often served as witnesses in court cases, provided testimony, and engaged in local disputes, indicating that their voices and opinions held weight. Midwives held significant influence in matters of health and childbirth, often being highly respected and essential figures in their communities. And women also formed informal networks of support, sharing knowledge and resources, particularly concerning health, childcare, and domestic matters. While legal and social structures of the Middle Ages certainly placed limitations on women and assigned primary authority to men, it is a profound historical inaccuracy to depict women as universally powerless. Through their roles as queens, regents, abbesses, mystics, businesswomen, and community members, medieval women exercised considerable influence, both formally and informally. They skillfully navigated the constraints of their time, leaving behind a rich legacy of agency, leadership, and contribution that fundamentally challenges the fiction of their total subservience.